Start screaming. I had a gag all lined up. Hello there, you lucky devils. And I'm sitting here looking at it. Happy Monday. So, I'll get this started in a minute. I had something I was going to tell you. Doesn't matter. Because should I save it? Or tell you now? It's not big news. It's just that, episode-wise, I'm going to do another episode about the company real quick. Not real quick. It's boring as hell. But you need to see it. And then, so, the episodes I did about the opium trade and the whale oil companies and stuff, if I can't find those, I will redo them soon. But I'm going to do this episode tonight about the company, and then tomorrow on Rumble, I'll be back on that Rumble channel. You need to click that link in the description of this video. Watch those couple of videos and then follow that channel. Because tomorrow I will go live and talk about the news. And I think you know what I mean. That's what I wanted to tell you. And then Wednesday, Thursday, I'll do another episode about the company. And I'm trying to figure out what to show you next. Because Charles Bohannon is going to come back into this thing. So I don't know if I have any more letters to show you between those two guys at the moment or not. So that's what's coming up. So let me just get started here. Drink of water. Let me start recording. I think that's it. Maybe I shouldn't say anything. Maybe I shouldn't jinx it. Manny just released an episode dropping hints that might be his last episode or his next to last episode. What are we going to do without him? What's Writing Jewels going to do without him?
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society.
You're in violation of secure communication procedures, Commodore.
So we just went ahead and fixed the glitch.
There is no America. There is no democracy.
Our fifth objective, a new world order.
There are no nations. There are no peoples. There are no Russians. There are no Arabs. There are no third worlds. There is no
Vast
West.
right-wing conspiracy.
What do you call it when the assassins accuse the assassin?
A new world order.
Thank you for plugging in to the Stones Unturned podcast.
Well, just a second there, Professor. We fixed the glitch.
I'm your host, Professor Thomas Henry Horan.
He reads everything.
Hello there, my beautiful, bountiful, bodacious. I need another word. Boosters? I need another superlative. It starts with a B. I'll think of something. Tonight's episode, brace yourselves. This will be very boring, but you need to know this stuff. Once again, let us review. The company operates the global economy. And by the time North and South America have been stumbled over, it's pretty close to a global economy. You know, you have between the British Isles all the way to Indonesia, right, under various empires whose job really is just to keep the roads open. An empire's job is just to keep the roads open. That's what their job is. Keep the roads open, keep trade flowing. And the company doesn't own the global economy, but it does operate it. It's the judges, the lawyers, the bankers, the accountants, the bankers, a lot of the politicians, all of the bankers. You have to watch Yes Minister on BritBox, which I subscribe to on Amazon for $6.99 a month. You've got to watch Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. There's Sir Desmond Glazebrook, who is the chairman of the board of one of the old investment banks in the city. Inside the old walls of the city is nothing but banks. And Why is he chairman of the board of this bank? Well, you begin to realize why he's chairman of the board, because of the way he deals with people, and including but not limited to both politicians and regulators and other bankers and their customers and the media. That's why he's chairman of the board. And there's a great line in the show where Sir Humphrey nominates him to be the chairman of some committee that he wants to manipulate. And Jim Hacker says, but he's a blithering, he goes, why? And Humphrey says, well, he'd make an excellent chairman. And Hacker says, but he's a blithering idiot. And Humphrey says, yes, but he'd make an excellent chairman. And he means it. And he went to school. They went to school together, too. So there's all that. Hi, Nathan. So what's that one? So the company operates the global economy. And the company we know of start out as people who become known as the Jews. And when we think of the Jews running the global economy, it's those Jewish kind of people, the people who used the Aramaic alphabet, which they borrowed from the Canaanites, which they borrowed from the Egyptians. Remember? This goes all the way back to 8000 BC. There's trade all up and down, especially up and down the Fertile Crescent. That's where the first settlements are taking place, blah, 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 blah. These become empires which are run mostly on trade, blah, 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 blah. Now, I have mentioned before, and I will mention briefly one more time, the Unitarian Pannonian Commies. Okay, so after the Middle Ages, what have we got here? After the Crusades are over and all these diasporae have taken place, the Jews are scattered and they gather and they're scattered and they gather again like fleas. I didn't say that. You know, you ever try to sweep fleas with a broom? Okay? Doesn't work. They just keep gathering right back on the dog. So this is the Pannonian Plain, this part of Europe here. Way north of Greece, Albania, Yugoslavia. This is the Pannonian Plain. This is where Czechoslovakia, Austria, Poland, Ukraine, and Romania, of course, Hungary, not Montenegro, but they all touch on the Pannonian Plain because it was the center of the world long before the Romans ever came along. Bratislava was the crossroads of the world. Okay? This is trade that not only comes across the Hellespont through Byzantium, but this is also trade that comes across the Russian steppes when the population gets to that level. Also sometimes known as the Hungarian Plain. The Romans called it Pannonia. And it was completely ungovernable. Completely ungovernable. No empire has successfully governed. They just distract you. You can keep them distracted fighting each other. And that's about all you can do to govern the Pannonian Plain. Well, you get these two massive, especially the one after the Muslim conquest of Jerusalem, you get this infusion of Sephardic Jews who settle, and Ashkenazi Jews who settle in the Pannonian Plain in all of these Eastern European countries. Those people will develop Unitarian. They are company people. You know how I know? Because they develop Unitarianism. Unitarianism says, well, the distinctions between Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, not that I rank them in any particular order, I would probably put Islam at the top, historically. But the reason, the hair splitting is for the yokels. We wise, enlightened ones know that they're three doors into one temple. But they didn't say it that way in the East. They come up with Unitarianism. There's one God, all religions pray to the same God. This is all developed after this influx of company Jews into Pannonia. They've been chased out of Arab lands. Or, well, what are now de facto Arab lands. Are you with me? They bring with them certain ideas and ideologies. And one of those is a communal type of economy. For example, in the Middle East in particular, ovens are communal. An oven is provided by the local ruler. Maybe you pay a tax or maybe you pay a surcharge after so much. But you make your bread and you bring it to the oven and they bake it for you. You have expert bakers, and it's a communal oven, which is paid for by the ruler, offered to the community. They're communal. They tend to be, their ancestors were pastoral herdsmen, so nobody owns any land. Everybody shares the land. So there's a communal, and Jesus is preaching straight up communism. Straight up communism. Okay, that branch of the company will continue to develop and fester along those lines until they develop communism, but not what gets implemented in Russia, right? Not the corporate, right? It's not state capitalism, communism. They're anti-industrialist. They also will develop Unitarian religion because business is business. So, look, people, there's a lot of money out there to be made. There's a road paved with gold that leads to silk, forests of silk, right? Mulberry trees, they get covered with these. That's a pest insect. You understand that, right? They eat the leaves. You have to have massive mulberry forests. And I love mulberries. My company, great auntie, on my mother's side of the family, had mulberry trees. And she had silkworms. So, but these people, first of all, Christians are outlawed by their own Christian empire from doing business with Muslims and Jews. So we have to solve this problem. So they invent Unitarianism and they invent communism, okay? Those are those Jewish communists that whatsies were always ranting and raving about. They were real. But they didn't care for Leninism at all. Are you with me? That's the communist revolution got hijacked by the industrialists, by the company, I argue. By the communist branch of the company. Now, as opposed to southwest Mediterranean world, the Mediterranean and North Africa in particular, okay, they maintain contact with the Arabs, with the Moors, with the Moops, with the company there, where they don't come into contact with this Catholic conquista. They've always gotten along. So instead of inventing Unitarianism, they've long been practicing what eventually becomes Freemasonry, which is all the Abrahamic religions. There are 3 doors into the same temple. Are you with me? The big difference is they always operated that way. I think the religious aspect of that goes back. And the pan-Abrahamic, business is business. We're all members of the same company here. I think that ethos prevailed permanently. It may have been, waxed and waned in influence and market share, but I think it was always there. And after the Norman conquest and after the Crusades, when the bridge to business has been rebuilt, it begins to grow in power and influence. And it creates an ecclesia within the ecclesia. It creates a parallel Christendom. The network of commanderies is like a cancer that spreads between the strongholds of the church. The church controlled the cities. The Templars eventually controlled everything else. And they ran every plantation like a factory farm. Every plantation was there were mines. They prospected. Every plantation they owned was exploited to the max very efficiently by the Templars. They will eventually develop capitalism, and the big difference is you have a differential in the proportion of shares owned by certain people or families. That's really the only difference between what we call capitalism and what the Soviets called, well, they didn't call it communism. That was a stepping stone society, and they never got around to establishing communism. The only real difference was, in America, you can own more than one share, and you can own shares in more than one company. That's the only real difference. But under National Socialism, capitalism is taxed heavily in various ways, you can call it what you want. They get you coming and going. You don't even know how many taxes you pay. You have no idea how many taxes you pay. You have no idea. I'll talk about that later. They will develop capitalism and what becomes Freemasonry, which was always the religion pretty much. This pretty much Nestorian Christianity never really stopped. It becomes Islam, but it's Nestorian Christianity, which is a form of Judaism anybody can join. That's the whole point. It's the southwestern Masonic version of Unitarianism, and in the Northeast, it becomes more, it's Trinitarian, not Trinitarian, Unitarian. It's Unitarian and more communist. Certainly anti-industrial. See, there hasn't been any industrialization yet. But what's going to happen is the Templar Masonic branch is going to get their hands on the advanced technology to ignite the Industrial Revolution in the first place. They are going to practice magic with both hands, which will turn into science and technology. You are watching me through what is literally a crystal ball. They have made the crystal ball real, and it works great. Somebody said that, oh, you've seen the memes on Facebook, right? Zoom conferences are just seances. You're talking to people who aren't there through an astral projection. There are no wires. There are no hoses. There are no puppets under the thing. You're hearing the voice of your boss over the ether, literally. But in the East, they tend to be a little more agrarian. They stay plugged into the Silk Road, etc., etc., etc. Their esoterica comes through what we will come to call the Rosicrucians, which also have a certain amount of scientific knowledge. But I think the industrialization it festers and it sprouts more for whatever reason. And I also think that it's because the Templars simply amassed more capital. I mean, like I say, plantations become economic plantations. I mean, there's industry, there's mining, there's agriculture, there's maximizing value. And it's very carefully and very competently managed. There's none of this crap about, I'll give you 10% of the profits. No, you have managers who are directly there overseeing every phase of the operation. And all the profits go, you will not believe where the profits go. The profits go east. The profits all go east. And you don't want to know what they spend it on. I will show you that in a future episode, what they spent all their money on. They were broke. And you won't believe what they spent their money on. I'll give you a hint. It was the modern day equivalent of between $2 and $3 trillion. And they spent it in the Middle East. You can probably guess what they spent it on over the course of 200 years of endless warfare, endless crusade. The point is, Corsica. Here's the island of Corsica. Remember, that's where Napoleon is from. Remember, I talked about this. And remember, the Normans conquer Sicily and indirectly conquer Corsica? Remember that? Well, one more time, the colony of Corsica went bankrupt and was foreclosed on, essentially. The company Bank of St. George of Genoa. The bank repossessed one of the oldest banks in the history of the world. The company Banco di San Giorgio. The company Bank of St. George. A Templar bank foreclosed on the island of Corsica, where Napoleon would come from. You know who, and by the way, this is a dinar. This is a dinar. Remember, I showed you some money. I showed you some Bardee money, and that becomes, they adopt the Rothschilds as a sept clan, these Ashkenazi trash from Eastern Europe, climbing that social ladder because, after all, and nobody harps on this more than the professor, but as they say, business is business. When I say they, I mean the people who wear their jewelry in the pool. Business is business. Where's that Kopeck? It's the size of a Kopeck. Where's that Kopeck I had? I have a Kopeck. I put it away. Okay, I didn't want to lose it. It was so tiny. These are tiny. These are tiny. These are like miniature M&Ms. These are about the size of a miniature M&M. Very high quality. Well, the French connection is really the Corsican connection. So remember, when the company loses control of the heroin trade, the opium trade, the China trade, as they like to call it, euphemistically, the guy who takes it over is Paul Carbone, who's from Corsica. He's descended from a nurse of Napoleon Bonaparte. And somebody else in his family was the housekeeper, the butler who economically ran the household of Napoleon Bonaparte when in exile. Pimped French prostitutes in Cairo, Egypt. I'm from Illinois. Cairo, Egypt. He was rescued in the desert by one Francois Spirito, another pimp. When a pimp meets a pimp coming through the sand. What are the odds? You know who else was a pimp? Father Abraham. Abram was a pimp. Don't forget that. He was a pimp and a merchant. A traveling merchant. He's traveling on the Silk Road like the day it fucking opens. He's first across the ribbon. He supplied the scissors to cut the ribbon on the Silk Road. Because he's from Ur of the Chaldees. And remember, the Chaldeans are the ones who take over the company and impose their handy-dandy Aramaic script. Rescued in the desert by another pimp named Francois Spirito, smuggled opium out of Shanghai before World War I. No, probably smuggled it into Shanghai. He served with distinction on the Western Front in the African Battalion, the Bat d'Af. After World War I, pimped French prostitutes in Peru. Remember Peru? Where the Shining Path? Blah, blah, blah. Well, Shangri-La might be in Peru. There's a really cool documentary I got to find for you guys again. About the possibility, about the Phoenicians had made it all the way to Peru. Set up a heroin and cocaine factory in Marseille with Lucky Luciano. Operations in Buenos Aires, Turkey, Lebanon, España, the right wing, of course. Those are all, you recognize those as Nazi countries after the war. Before the war, they were Corsican colonies. Well, not officially, but you know what I mean. There was the loading docks. These are all seaport cities. The loading docks. The Denari and other, what would later become mafia families. They don't call themselves mafia, right? We just call them mafia. Allied with the Carlingue, which were the Vichy state police in World War II. Remember, Herbert Mullen drove all the way up north into the mountains to that little town to murder that French priest who had been part of the anti-Carlingue, anti-Nazi, anti-Vichy, anti-Paul Carbone underground in Marseille. Remember, he was murdered by Herbert Mullen? Remember that? He murdered all those girls around town, drove up north, murdered that priest. Killed in 1943 as a member of the French resistance, according to reports. If you want to believe anything the Carlingue tell you. with Lucky Luciano, Paul Carbone is the one who plugged the Uncle Sucker into the global dock worker spy network. It was Paul Carbone. Uncle Sucker made a deal with Lucky Luciano, and Lucky Luciano had a deal with Paul Carbone. His union course continued as the French Connection till the 1970s. When you watch that movie, The French Connection, that's based on true events. That was the FBI and the CIA, with the help of the new Drug Enforcement Administration, shutting down the French Connection so the company could retake control of the opiate market globally. Then, 20 years later, they come after the cocaine. They let the mafia keep cocaine for about 15, 20 more years, and then they came after the cocaine. John Gotti's still alive? He's in prison, right? Hi, Charles. That's right. The Shining Path were Maoists. Don't forget that, please. And Mao was from China. So the Union course, which used to be big in the silk trade, now they replace those revenues with opiates, which are smuggled out of Turkey because China is outlawed. In World War II, the Japanese have seized all the opium plantations in Indochina. So you've got opium coming out of Turkey, which is being smuggled through Lebanon. That's what Lebanon was there for. Through Corsica and Marseille, and then on to Miami, Florida. Illegal heroin labs were first discovered near Marseille in 1937, run by Paul Carbone. The Corsican gang was protected by the Central Intelligence Agency and the SDECE after World War II in exchange for working to prevent French communists from bringing the old port of Marseille under their control. It isn't just about spying on the German Navy in World War II. It's about using the French Connection, using Carbone's Corsican Connection, Union Course, allies in the war against communism, which is just the other half of the company. Funny that. You know, they're the ones who came up with the idea of social Darwinism. Raw material came from Indochina, then Turkey. Turkish farmers were licensed to grow opium. Poppies were sold to illegal drug companies, but many sold excess produce to the underworld market where it was manufactured. The morphine paste was refined in Corsican laboratories in Marseille. It still is. Marseille is still the smuggler capital of the world. What did Allies go into southern France? Yeah. Well, remember I mentioned this guy. If you've been around that long, Colonel Jean Sassy, Corsican by birth, disappeared after the first Ardennes offensive. Was he Maquis? Was he Carlingue? Was he a double agent? Was he a free agent? He was involved in Operation Jedburgh, the French campaign of the OSS, and was part of Operation Hermit, which replaced Operation Prosper, which was betrayed by MI6, and it did not include Catherine Scher's parents. But MI6 were selling out the communist resistance fighters in France to the Gestapo so they wouldn't have to deal with them after the war. That's all been proven. And there's a very good documentary about that I mentioned in a couple previous episodes. Go back and watch that. This is Colonel Jean Sassy. In that, I couldn't find the clip real quick, but that color film of the Foreign Legion on their way to Dien Bien Phu, he's the narrator of that newsreel. 1954, French paratroops fighting in Indochina. That was Jean Sassy. He resurfaced after the war. He was French. He was Foreign Legion. Well, speaking of the company, you know nothing about the Foreign Legion. Anyway, Santo Trafficante Sr. and Jr. were from Cuba, and they were partners of Paul Carbone. So the CIA, very deeply in bed with Carbone and the Corsican connection, were deeply in bed with Trafficante, obviously. And this is bigger than any presidency. This company's been around for 2,000 years, over 2,000 years. You can't let some TV pretty boy from Harvard screw up what you've spent the last 2,300 years building. I think we all understand that. Well, I haven't mentioned the Minoans much, but obviously the Templar half, the capitalist half of the company, that's the Minoan Empire. And there are some modern historians and archaeologists who think that the Minoan Empire was actually founded by Sumerian mercenaries or Akkadian mercenaries. Well, Sumerian mercenaries, because they think that the Minoan language is related to the Sumerian language. But we don't know the Minoan language and we don't know the Sumerian language. So we're stumped, but they think there's a connection there. And I think there's a connection there because it turns out that the Minoan Empire also relied heavily on opium. And I just thought it was funny that the Tudor rose looks exactly like an opium puppy. Because it's right after this that the British are going to get involved in the opium trade, what they call the China trade. But before all of that, this is 1484 or something, when Henry Tudor becomes king, and the Tudor rose, which becomes like the swastika of the Tudor dynasty. It's all over England. It's plastered everywhere in England. I think it's cool. I think it's a cool idea. It's a union of the houses of York and Lancaster. So the House of Plantagenet is reunified again under Henry, and you have this really cool visual logo that everybody gets instantly. Everybody gets it instantly. The red rose is bigger, but the white rose is in the middle. It's in the heart. Then you got this little gold halo. You got this little gold crown here. It looks exactly like an opium poppy. I just thought that was interesting. Remember Evo Younger? Remember who was the attorney general or district attorney when Bugliosi was deputy district attorney and he prosecuted that bullshit fictional case against the Manson family? Remember him? Well, this material comes from a transcript interview with Justice Lynn Compton. Lynn Compton worked with Evo Younger, not only in CIA, but also in Office of Special Investigations. Evo Younger ordered Aaron Stovitz. Aaron Stovitz was the original prosecutor assigned to the Tate case, right, or whatever? And Evo Younger ordered him no more interviews because he was saying that Atkins is faking mental illness, all this other stuff. That's Evo Younger. So he fires Aaron Stovitz and appoints Boogie Baby, Bugliosi, to be the lead prosecutor, and he does press conferences every 5 minutes. I guess it's not so much... I guess it depends on what you're saying. He was the boss over Bugliosi during the Manson family trials, and then he went to California and became Attorney General of California, and he became Dick Wally's boss, investigating the zebra murders. So not only on the zebra murders connected, they have the same cult as the Zodiac Killer. Not only do you have the same two detectives from the Zebra Squad who go and they do the revised sketch of the Paul Stein killer and all that other stuff, they're also the lead detectives on the zebra murders. Not only that, but Evo Younger goes from directly supervising the prosecutor in the Manson family case to directly supervising the prosecutor in the Death Angels, the zebra murders case. I thought that was an interesting coincidence because it's the same cult. And he's familiar with that cult because he did PSYOPs in Southeast Asia in World War II and Vietnam. He agreed with Alioto that extraordinary crime called for extraordinary police action. Well, who can argue with that? Larry Green from Berkeley, California, he photographed a lot of their attacks with a Polaroid camera. That reminds me of the Lake Berryessa attack. They had to do that to prove that they had actually killed somebody, to get their wings as death angels. They got brownie points for who they killed. I think they got the most brownie, 3. Each member who killed 4 white children, 5 white women, or 9 white men was awarded with wings that certifies his angel status. Photograph of the murder was requested as proof. According to Anthony Harris, there were at least 15 death angels who were displayed on the board. Evel Younger's office had secretly compiled a list of 45 murders which had taken place throughout the state. All victims were white, and all the known suspects were linked to the Black Muslim movement. But he knows all about the death cult of the Zodiac Killer. So do the Zebra Squad. It's the same cult. And by the way, Leonard Lake told one of his old buddies from high school that he had joined a death cult in the Haight, and if it wasn't that cult, what cult could it be? Because nobody has ever thought of any other death cult in the Haight at that time. That was the only one. So Paul Turner is asking Lynn Compton, when you got out of the Army, at some point you were in the Air Force Reserve, correct? I switched to the Air Force Reserve because it was right after the end of the war that they'd made the Air Force a separate branch. And the Air Force created its own criminal investigation division called the OSI, Office of Special Investigations. And so these guys would come, were working OSI as reservists. So it was in order to get into the Office of Special Investigations that I switched to the Air Force and did my reserve duty for a long time as an OSI agent. And it was in that capacity that I met Evel Younger. You remember who created the Office of Special Investigations? You know who created Project Blue Book? We've been reading his letters. Positive guy keeps talking about the Grand Chignon. Yeah, I'd like to know who he was too. Because he'd been in the Office of Special Forces during World War II, which is the forerunner. Had been in the OSS during World War II, which is the forerunner of the CIA, and he was very active with his military career as well. He's talking about Evel Younger. And when was that? Well, it had been either late December 45 or early January of 46. And Lynn is a man named Lynn, okay? History of the organization. This is from the CIA's website. The Office of Special Operations, that's the OSO, CIA OSO. Major General Evel Younger. He rose to Major General Air Force Reserve. He had been in the OSO during World War II. Office of Special Operations is a direct carryover from the Office of Strategic. So he was OSS, then OSO. When that organization was disbanded, okay, sorry about that. First he was OSS World War II into China, Burma, India. Then he was OSO, Office of Special Operations, which didn't last very long. Carryover from the OSS. When that organization was disbanded at the end of the war, the Secret Intelligence Branch and the X2 Branch, Counterespionage, were retained as a strategic services unit under the Office of the Assistant Secretary of War. So there's a lot of shuffling going on. When the president created the Central Intelligence Group in January 46, the Strategic Services Unit was transferred to that organization and became the Office of Special Operations. This is Evel Younger. Principal assets brought forward from OSS days included some experienced personnel. The nucleus of organizations operating principally in Germany and China, the counter-espionage files of OSS, and established liaison with certain foreign intelligence services, while the organization in China has been largely destroyed by the communists. Darn the luck. The organization in Germany has been developed and expanded. Inherited after the conclusion of World War II was the he's talking about the Galen Network, World War II was the responsibility for coverage of Latin America, previously held by the FBI. Handed over very successfully, and then handed over to the CIA catastrophically. Today, the Office of Special Operations is organized into 7 foreign divisions, 131 fixed field stations, blah, blah, blah. There is a high degree of professional competence among the division and staff chiefs in OSO, although it is apparent that this professional competence has not always been utilized to its fullest extent in the development of an espionage service directed at the principal targets of intelligence. No particular emphasis is being placed by OSO on espionage against the USSR. Huh. I guess they didn't get the memo. Better dead than red. There is an extreme shortage of personnel in all classes. Considerable OSO effort is being dissipated from the major mission of establishing a long-term clandestine espionage organization. Particular examples of the dissipation of effort is the emphasis on supporting the 8th Army in Korea with intelligence detachment. That's Tony Poe. I forgot to highlight that. They're talking about Anthony Poshepny, 8th Army, CIA liaison to 8th Army at the border before the shooting starts. And that had to be Evel Younger. Where else did he served in Korea? It had to be Evel Younger. Evel Younger knew Tony Poe, who was very good friends with Hal Snook. But Tony Poe also is the fourth spook in those pictures at Dealey Plaza. Also, OSO does not have the trained personnel to do this job at the present time, and the net gains for CIA will be minor in contrast with the gains by use of the same personnel in long-term espionage operation. If this is 1946 and Tony Poe is in college, Tony Poe will not join the CIA until 49 and then go to Korea in 49, right before the war starts. There is not sufficient emphasis in OSO on counter-espionage operations. Sounds like they're not treating the commies as a serious enough threat to prevent them from infiltrating the holy motherland of apple pie. Funny that. OSO rules and regulations should be reviewed to allow greater initiative and judgment by responsible branch staff division and station chiefs. Somebody is holding them back on a very tight leash. Blah, 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 blah. Insufficient liaison, blah, 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 blah. 2 lines not declassified. Omitted here is the body of the report. In June 51, CIA formalized the Red Cap program to monitor Soviet officials abroad and encourage them to defect. We will hear from Red Cap again. These attempts, codenamed Red Sox, enjoyed very limited success. Well, darn the luck. The Soviets were the spy masters, don't kid yourselves. This was recognized by 54, and a program using legal travelers for short-term observation of the Soviet Union was set up under the codename Redskin. That goes back to 1954. So as a result of this report, the Directorate of Operations is formed. Under Walter Peter Smith, directly operated by Alan Dulles. And in 52, the Office of Policy Coordination and the Office of Special Operations were merged to form the Directorate of Plans. Whatever. Directorate also housed special groups for conducting counter-narcotics. They were supposed to be doing counter-Soviet and failing at that. They were supposed to be doing counter-narcotic, and by the most amazing coincidence I've heard all day, they also failed to shut off the massive fire hose of narcotics coming into America the day after the war ended. Oh, here's good news. Not only counter narcotics and counter terrorism, but also counter nuclear proliferation, so we can all sleep safe in our beds tonight. CIA was initially the financial manager for OPC and OSO, authorized to handle unvouchered funds, the ones that Elon was belly aching about, by National Security Council Document 4A of December 47, the launching of peacetime covert action operations, which is illegal under international law. NSC 4A made the Director of Central Intelligence responsible for psychological warfare, establishing at the same time the principle that covert action was an exclusively executive branch function. Well, it's mine. Says who? Says me. He who has the gold makes the rules. One more time. Having money is not the same thing as making money. Initially, the supervision by committee allowed the OPC to exercise early use of its covert with dissatisfied officials. NSC 10-2 directed the CIA to conduct covert rather than merely psychological operations, defining them as all activities which are conducted or sponsored by this government against hostile foreign states or groups or in support of friendly foreign states or groups, but which are so planned and executed that any U.S. government responsibility for them is not evident to unauthorized persons, and that if uncovered, the U.S. government can plausibly disclaim any responsibility for them. You shouldn't have put that on paper. Didn't you take any pages from Hootler's book? Never sign anything. I never signed anything. Propaganda, economic warfare, preventive direct action, including sabotage, demolition, and evacuation measures. Subversion, assistance to underground resistance movements, blah, 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 indigenous anti-communist elements. Guerrilla warfare was outside the statement of this scope, but such operations came under partial CIA control with NSC 10-5 of October 1951. So within a very short period of time, it's like, well, let's just add one more. Let's just do this. Let's just do this. Psychological Strategy Board was created. You don't need to see all of this in one swallow. Anyway, so Lynn Compton, who served with Evel Younger in OSI, was magically assigned the Sirhan case. And the Golden State Killer case, by the way. Later in my reserve career, I switched to the Judge Adjutant General, and ended up being attached to the JAG office of a command called SAMSO, Space and Missile Systems Organization, headquartered at El Segundo. This building down there with a missile out in front of it, down in El Segundo. They tore it down. Did they? They did that last year. And is that where you did I guess that was in the National Guard. It was called drills. You did it at the facility at El Segundo. Yeah, when I was in the JAG Corps, yeah. When I was in the OSI, we were over at Maywood. There was an air base over in Maywood. You don't say. We'll come back to that. Just make a note. Air Force Base at Maywood. So he handled this case of sexual assault against a producer. I'm 99.99% sure this was somebody Charlie worked with in 58 and 59. His name was Louis Snyder, who was a producer in the early days of television on a thing called Snyder Telescriptions. These were the first music videos. Snyder Telescriptions produced the first music videos to be sold to either to the networks or to be syndicated to local TV stations. I'm 99% sure this is the producer that Charlie worked for when he was getting whores together and blah, 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 blah. Because this is the business Charlie gets right. He's supposed to be a star of music videos when he gets out in 67. It's this guy. So I filed a complaint against this guy. Blah, 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 blah. I don't know him. And a friend of mine calls me up who knew the guy, and he says, boy, you really got the right guy on that one. That guy's an SOB, and blah, blah, blah. And I said, okay, great. So anyway, one day he calls me again, and he says, that Snyder was out in the bar the other night. He's out on bail, and he's telling everybody he's got this fix. He's got $15,000 down in the DA's office to square this. And I said, well, okay. So anyway, I'm going about my business, and I'm in the hall one day, and Ernie Roll, who is now the DA, stops me in the hall and says, hey, did you know that case you filed the other day? Bad case. That girl's a bum. And I said, okay, it's out of my hands. It's in the mill. What the hell? Do whatever you want with it. I don't care. Snyder telescriptions from 50 to 52 were film versions of popular and classical musical performances. Lionel Hampton, Alan Jones, Gloria Jean, Tex Williams, The Weavers, Red Nichols, Cab Calloway, Tony Pastor, Charlie Barnett, Les Brown, Gail Storm, Carolina Cotton, Denise Lore, April Stevens, Connie Haynes, Merle Travis, Bob Wills, and the King Sisters. Louis Delmonte Snyder died 1971. Born in Kiev, Russian Empire. Married a German girl, 14 August, Norfolk, Madison, in Nebraska. Norfolk, Nebraska, right outside of Omaha. Lived in Chicago and Los Angeles. A pioneer production of telescriptions in the 1950s. Snyder was said to be the first to experiment with color TV on the coast and produce the first TV show for Liberace, whose folks were from the old country, Hungary. Liberace was gay. Anybody who knew that could have ruined Liberace. My parents went to their graves believing that Liberace was not gay, because he was always seen in the tabloids with beautiful young girls. He kept his private life in the closet. You had to do that in those days. So Snyder could have been blackmailing Liberace, who was huge. James Brown said, I got my hair from Elvis Presley and my clothes from Liberace. Native language is Hebrew. Began as a real estate and insurance agent. Oh, sorry. This was supposed to be a surprise. By the way, Lynn Compton also worked on the Sirhan case. So he, younger, picks me and says, well, you handle it. I'm Professor Thomas Henry Horan, asking you to please stay plugged in to the Stones Unturned podcast.
He reads everything.
You better bet your bippies he reads everything. So in the next episode that I do on this, there'll be an episode here, an episode there. Then I'm going to do, the next episode is going to be about RFK, and was there a second gunman in that case? You know what's really funny? The CIA has, for 60 some odd years, has pushed their own conspiracy theory about a second gunman in the JFK case, because I guess that takes the heat off of Oswald. For whatever reason, the CIA would want to take the heat off Oswald. But the CIA to this day poo-poos the idea of a second gunman in the RFK case. It's just funny. Not funny like the Italian army, just funny.